Really excited to be here today, and I'm glad you could be here too, as we're going to go through Psalm chapter 37. If you want to go ahead and open your Bibles up to Psalm chapter 37, that would be a great place for us to start. And it's going to be a really good psalm for us to start with. It deals with the idea of when you are tempted to envy wicked people. And there's some challenges that come out of that. It begins in verse 1 in this great way. Do not fret because of evildoers. Do not fret because of evildoers, nor be envious of the workers of iniquity. That's a pretty great way to start out. And what it does is present to us a very human issue. And sometimes we think we might be insulated from the envy of the wicked or our concerns for the sinners because we say, well, we're good people, we are Christians, and this is not something that really comes into our mind. However, when you start thinking about the reality of life, and this is a very practical psalm, we find out as humans, sometimes when we deal with trouble, when we deal with issues in life, when life takes on certain complications because of illness or because our relationships seem to get a little out of control, because maybe financially we find ourselves in difficult situations, we start looking at other people and go, well, why do they have it so good? Why do they seem to have a certain amount of peace? Why do they have happiness? Why do they seem to be blessed when they're not even good people? They do wicked things. In fact, their life was full of wickedness. Why does that happen? And maybe I should be a little bit more like them. Maybe I should want what they want. Maybe I should make some changes to pursue that kind of life. That's probably a little bit more familiar. You may be caught up in that pretty intently right now, or you may have had a hint of it at some point. Psalm chapter 37 is great because it helps us navigate that very, very human question. It's something that God's people has wrestled with forever, since the beginning of humans. Some of them very successfully. If you remember, Moses is commended because he had that situation unfold when he grew up and he was raised in Pharaoh's court and he was surrounded by immense amount of power and wealth and adoration, and yet he chose to leave that, seeking something better. And even still, there were times when in Israel's history they were challenged with this situation because they would look around and they would see what other nations are doing and they would make decisions based on that. They'd have that envy of the other nations. Doesn't it look better with what they're doing? Isn't it greater with what's going on with them? So God, give us an earthly king. Oh, we're envious of that earthly king. God, look at the way that they worship their idols and let us pursue them. They failed in that regard. And yet we see this happen in the New Testament as well. And yet today we see it happen with us as well. It's a human issue. It's a human issue. So even though this psalm was written, maybe 3,000 years ago, because it deals with such a core human issue, it helps us navigate through the way that we may deal with these ideas of how do we deal with the temptation to want to live like the wicked or to be envious of what they do. What I'd like for us to do is to start off by picturing a big wall. And on this wall, what we're going to do is we're going to hire some person to come in, and he's going to paint a picture of a person that you value or that you look up to, a person that you esteem to be like, a person whose quality of life you think is great. What would he put up there for you? What's in your heart? What's the kind of life that you look at and you say, yeah, there's peace, there's contentment. There's the one where my problems might be taken care of if I could just live like that one. I could be held up and viewed as somebody. I could have meaningfulness if I was like this person. And I want you to think about who that is in your mind right now. And don't think about, I know we're in a church building, and if you're watching online, you're like, well, this is a church service, so let me think something churchy. Maybe that's a true answer, but I want you to give me the one you really think about. If no one could see it, and it was just you looking up here, even though we're all about to, what would you put? a lot of people would put this person. Now, I'm watching your faces to see how you react. You may say, I don't know who that is. And good for you. Good for you. But some of you are like, I know exactly who that is, and she's awesome, and she's got so many followers, and she's incredibly wealthy, and people look up to her, and I want to be just like her. If your daughter told you that, what would you do? Child, shush. Don't say such things. Not that we hit children. But you'd be sadly disappointed because while this person does have wealth and while this person does have tremendous amount of fame and while they do have a certain degree of influence in the world, it was generated from a wicked source. It was generated from a terrible, terrible place that is caught up in illicit sexuality, that is caught up in narcissism, that's caught up in a way of viewing yourself above all other people. And so there would be a disappointment with that. So don't be envious of this kind of life. It changes over time. I remember when I was a kid, or a really young kid, this was the guy, right? This was the guy, Fred Rogers. My goodness. As you all know, sometimes people will call me Mr. David at one point. I really wrestle with that because it's not what I'm used to. And I'll say, no, Mr. Rogers is fine. And I've had a few people laugh and go, why would you want to be called Mr. Rogers? Well, first, I am a Rogers, so that'll do. But second of all, why would you not want to be called Mr. Rogers? What a guy, man. What a guy. There was even recently a documentary about him that came out because of his kindness and his gentleness and because of his authenticity, because he really cared about people and because he was willing to put himself out there. It can't help but affect people. I was listening to a guy last night that was talking about watching this documentary about him, and it brought him to tears. This was a hard guy who's pretty self-involved, but this guy's life affected people in such a way that a documentary about his life would bring you to tears. Oh my goodness, that's a man of value. But then as you get older, you start viewing other people, right? Like middle school. Your view of a person of value changes a little bit. I watched The Godfather. That was a big deal. That guy, wow, he's powerful and he's so cool and he sits behind the desk and he's got these great things. But he's a criminal, okay? He's a criminal. We can't elevate that guy at all. You get a little bit older and you have a different kind of hero you look up to, George Clooney. Oh, my goodness, he's a Kentuckian. We got to cheer the hometown boy, right? He's a Kentuckian, and forgive me, and then you've got this guy, and he makes amazing movies. He made the jump from the small screen to the big screen. He was Danny Ocean. He directs great movies. He's very caring about people in the world, and he uses his influence to try to help people. George Clooney's kind of the guy. He married a beautiful woman who's super, super smart, carries herself very well. George Clooney, kind of the guy, right? Last year, George Clooney made over $200 million. Wow, George Clooney. Here's the problem. And it's one you can't ignore. Even though you might want to like the guy, you may not like him, that's okay. He made that money from tequila. He invested in a company and started a tequila company with his buddy. I can't cheer that on, George Clooney. I can't do it. Tequila is not one of those things where you say, yeah, I drank tequila, that brought me peace in life. I drank tequila, that helped my relationships. It doesn't happen. You might hear, hey, I got in a fight last night. What were you doing? Drinking tequila. My relationships fell apart last night. What were you doing? I was drinking tequila. I hope none of us drank tequila on our way to church this morning. It just doesn't add up. So there's this wicked side that exists. And I can't hold that in a high regard. And so what we find ourselves is when we encounter people in the world, we want to like some people, but there's elements of their lives that you just can't ignore, and we can't elevate that. And as Christians, we have to separate ourselves from it. Psalm 37 is one of the chapters that helps us navigate that. Whoever you had in your mind, I don't know, but you may have wrestled with that in some regard. Maybe it was Tiger Woods. Maybe it was Ricky Williams. Maybe it was somebody else, where there's that balance that goes on in life. I want us to spend some time with David. David, the king, the warrior king. What a complicated figure he was, right? This was a guy that's described as being after God's own heart. My goodness, that's a guy I want to pay attention to. This is a guy that when he would go into battle, he would consult with God first. Okay, I want to pay attention to that. This is a guy that when he was oppressed and when he felt like the world was coming down around him, he would take that to God first. Okay, that's a win. This is a guy that when any other king was to come after him in the history of Israel, if they were a good king, it would say that they walked in the footsteps of their father David. That's how you knew you were doing a good job as a king, because you did it in the way that David would do it, so there was a comparison to be made. He was a guy worth paying attention to because he's going to point you towards God. David's someone worth valuing. Now, in Psalm chapter 37, later on in the chapter, it tells us, it gives us a little bit of a hint if you're in there, and in the later parts, verse 25, kind of gives us an indication. He says, I've been young and now am old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his descendants begging bread. So David's a little bit older. He's got a little bit more experience, and that's pretty incredible because he's going to give us some things that he's learned in his experience in his relationship with God. So we should pay attention. It is also one of those psalms that is an acrostic psalm, which is great. Justin spoke to us about that the other day. It was Psalm 119, 145, 9 and 10, and there's several others. There's about 7 in the book of Psalms that are basically an acrostic. Each of the stanzas that begins in this song, this poem, this instructional poem, is going to correspond to one of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And that's pretty great because what that intends to do is to help us to understand it and structure the poem so that we can better learn it, or the people that spoke Hebrew. Generally, it's 4 lines to each of the stanzas, with the exceptions being verses 14 and 15, which has 6 lines, and then in verses 25 and 26, which has 5 lines. But there is definitely a structure. There's an intention to it. And in fact, there's a bit of an artistry that's involved. Something worth appreciating because it's beautiful in the fact that it is God's word, but it's also beautiful in the way that God presented it through David to have such a structure that we can appreciate. And thirdly, it's also beautiful because it is a functional bit of artistry. There's a purpose behind it that's going to serve not just the current generation that he's in, but the generations to come. And so being that it's an acrostic, it has that sort of mnemonic device that allows the student to learn from it. It's going to direct the thoughts of the poem. And so what we have in Psalm 37 is sort of an anthology of wisdom sayings, which makes it very interesting. He's trying to bestow wisdom to the students. And the way that this would be done in an instructional sense was so that the teacher, David in this case, or any of the Hebrew teachers that would come later, they would use this as a way to instruct morality and the religious life. It wasn't just about giving facts to people from simply an intellectual standpoint, but a wisdom saying so that you could help someone understand how to shape their morality, how to deal with life, and so that these people could have a relationship with God that was very real, very vibrant, and very exciting. That's one way that we should approach Psalm chapter 37. And so we begin with it. Do not fret because of evildoers, nor be envious of workers of iniquity. And we know it was kind of effective because we see Solomon, David's son, say something very similar when he's writing the Proverbs. So this is something that kind of dove into him, and he would repeat it or come very, very close to it on Proverbs 24:19. Do not fret because of evildoers, nor be envious of the wicked. So it was carrying on in that regard. In Proverbs chapter 23, verse 17, he says, do not let your heart envy sinners, but then he gives the contrast. But be zealous for the fear of the Lord all the day. I think he learned that from Psalm 37 or some other instruction. Because if we read the next few verses, we're going to see that David issues a contrast in the teaching as well. Read with me here in Psalms 37, 1 through 4. Do not fret because of evildoers, nor be envious of the workers of iniquity, for they shall soon be cut down like the grass and wither as the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and feed on his faithfulness. Delight yourself also in the Lord, and he shall give you the desires of your heart. Did you catch the contrast? Don't fret because of them. Don't worry about them. Don't be anxious about them. They're going to be cut down like grass. There's a weakness to them. It's going to fail. Let's flip that and go to the other side and put your trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and feed on his faithfulness. Delight in the Lord, and he shall give you the desires of your heart. There's an incredible contrast, not just in the consequence of the behavior and the blessing of the behavior that you choose to do. The wicked will have a consequence. The righteous will have a benefit or a blessing that comes out of that. But it's going to be focused on the Lord. Keep your attention and your direction on the Lord. And really, this is going to set up the entire chapter in which he's going to reinforce the why. Why the morality that we have in God? Why the distinction between these who are wicked and who are practicing sin? And why should we come in conflict with life? Why do we follow God in this regard? He's going to lay it out. These 4 verses give us sort of an introduction to that. First of all, the consequence. Now, generally, you know I hide a skull somewhere in my PowerPoints. This one I wanted to be a little bit more obvious. There it is. Because I want you to understand how dire the consequence is. Sometimes I don't think we pay enough attention to consequences. Sometimes I think when we present God's will, we want to give only the good stuff. And it's almost like we only want to present it in the sparkly, beautiful package that it is, but we ignore the consequence. And if we do that, we shortchange God's message. Because God didn't say ignore the consequence. God gave us these consequences. And the one way that I would like for you to consider the consequences isn't, oh man, God's trying to beat us down. Oh man, how horrible is this? This is about shame and fear and guilt, and sometimes those can be good, but it's not what it's about. When God gives you consequences, it's an act of love that he's given you because he's establishing the parameters, the life that you can live in and be close to him. And when you break those parameters, there's a consequence. He doesn't want you to go through that consequence. God is not willing that any should suffer, but that all should come to repentance. But he's telling you this. He's given you these consequences because it's a message of come to me. Stay away from that. Bad things are going to happen, and I don't want that to happen to you. God's not pushing you away by giving you the consequences in detail. He's saying, come to me. Come close to me. But you've got to know there's consequences. We do this in life. I was talking to my brother last night, and he was talking about an issue he'd had with his daughter. He'd bought a dog that's going to take care of his goats. He's in the goats are his hobby right now. He's got about 50 goats, and he's on his way today to buy more goats. And his friend Tyler is going to buy a dog for herding the goats. Now, part of the training with these dogs is that you raise them as a puppy, and you put them in the goat pen, and you have them around the animals, and so they're quite used to it, and then you train them in that regard. Problem is, my niece loves animals, and she doesn't want her dog to herd. She wants a cute pet. So she would sneak in and let it out and go out and play with it a little bit. And he was like, why is my dog getting out all the time? And then he busted her. And he said, listen, you need to understand something really quick. Here's the consequence. You let that dog out, I'm going to come down on you pretty hard, and we're getting rid of all the pets. Boom. She stopped immediately, because where my brother's concerned, one warning's all you get. The consequence is very real, and it will happen. So solve the problem. With God, he's given us the consequence. We need to understand it's very real. It is sure. It is definite. And he gives us a lot. In verse 2, he says they're going to be cut down like grass. He says the wicked were going to wither as green herb. Verse 9, they're going to be cut off. Verse 10, they shall be no more. Verse 13, the Lord laughs at them. The wicked may elevate themselves up and say, I have life under control. This is mine to rule over. God laughs. What are you, man? What are you, wickedness, that you would even stand up and proclaim such a thing? Verse 15 says, their sword shall enter their own heart. Their bows shall be broken. 17, their arms shall be broken. Verse 20, they shall perish. Verse 20 again, they shall vanish. Verse 22, cut off. Verse 28, their descendants should be cut off. Verse 36, Go with me to verse 36, and we'll start in verse 35. Consequences. I have seen the wicked in great power, David writes, and spreading himself like a native green tree. Yet he passed away, and behold, he was no more. Indeed, I sought him, but he could not be found. Doesn't that remind you a little bit in Psalm 1 when it talks about the faithful person that would sit and he would take root as a tree and he would be prosperous as a tree and he would be near the water? But the contrast is this is someone who tries to establish themselves in their power and in their wickedness and say, how great am I? And God says, you are not great. You will fall. You will vanish. You will rot. You will disappear. It's an emptiness that exists in that. Verse 38, the transgressors shall be destroyed together. The future of the wicked shall be cut off. Hammers those verses again and again and again. Could he have just said it once? Probably. Would we have listened if it was just once? Probably not. Humans have a tendency to have lessons repeated over and over and over again, and that's good. We need that to be reminded. And so he does it. In this one psalm, he gives us repeated teachings. There are consequences. They are consequences, and they are devastatingly bad. Do not give your attention to the wicked. They have consequences to be cut off. Don't be among them. But he ends it with this. The salvation of the righteous is from the Lord. He is their strength in the time of trouble. And the Lord shall help them and deliver them, and he shall deliver them from the wicked and save them because they trust in him. And so it's not just about consequences in the chapter. He also gives us these very sure blessings. And I want to make sure we understand that there's certainty in both of these things. There's certainty in the consequences and certainty in the blessings, and we can have peace in knowing that. And so God says that you shall have the desires of your heart. More on that in a moment. Verse 5, he says he shall bring it to pass, his promises. 6, bring forth righteousness to light. You may find yourself in darkness and you may find yourself oppressed by the wicked and they seem to be prospering, but that's the darkest moments exist. There will be light to come out of it, and God can make that happen. Trust in him for that. He says the meek shall inherit the earth. Big one. Jesus repeats in Matthew 5:5, delight in the abundance of peace. Verse 17 says the Lord upholds the righteous. 18, the Lord knows the days of the upright. And he keeps going on and on and on and gives these very sure blessings that are coming. Verse 28, the Lord does not forsake his saints. They are preserved forever. The righteous shall inherit the land. And we see there are 19 verses of blessings, sure blessings, in contrast to the consequences, the dire consequences. And this is the most basic level of teaching that he's saying. Why would you be tempted to follow after the wicked? Let me explain to you why that's a bad idea. 1, there's terrible consequences. 2, if you stick with God and stay faithful to him, there's incredible blessings that come out of that. But he wants us, 3, to understand the character and the nature of the wicked and the righteous. And so he gives us these verses which explains, this is what the wicked do. Have you forgotten? This is what they're looking for. The wicked plots against the just and gnashes at him with his teeth. You may envy them and their life might look pretty good, but the truth is they are opposed to righteousness. They'll strike it down if it gets in their way. They'll take advantage of it if it gets in their way. They will take from it if the opportunity presents itself. The wicked have drawn the sword and have bent their bow to cast down the poor and the needy, to slay those who are of upright conduct. What level of contrast do you need to say, wait a minute, doesn't God care about the poor and the needy? Why would I be envious of someone who is out to harm the poor and the needy? Jesus didn't do that. Didn't Jesus care about the woman at the well enough to sit and talk to her and give him this personal teaching? And in a time when she was a Samaritan, why be around her? And the time when she was a woman, oh my goodness, they didn't have the same status that they should have, but Jesus gave her that. And she was a broken woman in her relationships, and still Jesus gave her the blessing of a teaching and gave her this moment of care. What about the centurion servant? What about the Syrophoenician woman? What about the blind men that would cry out to Jesus, heal me, heal me? And the crowds would say, no, leave him alone. And Jesus would turn to them and give them this care and this concern. Jesus certainly cared for the poor and the needy. Why would we be envious? Or why would you associate yourself with people that would be opposed to the poor and the needy? You're in conflict with God. Know their character. The wicked watches the righteous and seeks to slay him, he says. The wicked borrows and does not repay, but the righteous shows mercy and gives. And here we have a sort of a transitional idea within the verse, because he's saying, here's what the wicked do, but the righteous, they show mercy and they give. Because of this, we know some things. You know people by what they do. You know them by their fruit. If you have all the hands of all the people of the world raised up in the air, you wouldn't have to mark them with wicked and righteous. You would know it by what they do. The verse says the wicked borrows and does not repay. The righteous shows mercy and gives. We have a situation of takers and givers. Takers and givers. If the summation of your life is the fact that you are trying to take and consume for yourself, you ought to rethink that. If the people that you've turned your heart to and you're envious of the works that they do are takers that try to consume and keep for themselves, to elevate themselves and build themselves up, you ought to rethink that. It's very different than what God does. Over in Philippians chapter 2, starting in verse 3, says, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look not only for your own interests, but also for the interests of others. We need to be givers, people who give. This is exactly what God does. He's a giver. He's a giver in the way that he created the universe and he created the Garden of Eden. He didn't have to make it magnificent, but he did. And even when the fall took place and Adam and Eve disobeyed him and they were cast out, he gave them opportunity. He gave a great promise to Abraham that would be fulfilled through Jesus. He gave in the sense that Jesus came to earth. He gave up heaven to come and live with the creation. He gave of himself continually in the way that he would interact with the creation. Although they would reject him and they would abuse him and they would mistreat him, they would ignore him, and this is God that's with them, he still gave of himself. They needed understanding and teaching, and he gave that to them. They needed an example, and he gave that to them. They needed freedom from sin, and so he went to the cross to give that to us. The idea is that if we are going to be righteous people, if we're going to be people of peace, if we're going to be God's people, we've got to be givers. We've got to be abundant givers. The takers are in conflict with God. A little that a righteous man has is better than the many riches of the wicked. For the arms of the wicked shall be broken, but the Lord upholds the righteous. Now, it's important here that we understand that he's not really talking about wealth and poverty. This is not the point. Whether you have wealth or power or you have fame or whatever, it's not really the issue. That's simply the context of your faithfulness. You can be very, very wealthy and be very faithful to God. You can be very famous and be faithful to God. You can be incredibly poor and be faithful to God. The brilliance of your life, the success of your life is found in how you use that context in service to God. What he's wanting us to understand is that worldly success will never, ever supersede spiritual success. No matter what accomplishments you have in the world, it will never be as important as your spiritual accomplishments. So, if you have fame, use it for God. It's a platform. Use it for God. If you have wealth, use it for God. It's a platform of opportunity. You won't find peace in and of itself, but you will find peace in using it for God. If you have power, use it for God. My goodness, we're talking about King David. Use it for God. If you have none of those things, use your life for God. How many people in the Bible had none of it? Quite a few. How many people had a lot of it? Quite a few. The point of their life was that they used it for God, not for wicked purposes. And so what we find in Psalms 37 is that he's telling us you need to make sure your life is not about the wicked people. Don't fret because of them. Don't give them your time. Don't give them your energy. Don't give them your attention. Don't give them a place in your heart. Your life should wholly and completely be focused on God, focused on the Lord. And he does it multiple times. Trust in the Lord, he says. Delight in yourself in the Lord. Who are you living for? Where do you find your happiness? It must be in the Lord. Commit yourself to the Lord. Rest in the Lord. Wait on the Lord. It's about the Lord in everything. In fact, depart from evil and do good, he says. If you're departing from evil, you're turning away from the wickedness. And if you're going to be doing good, good's only defined by what God does and God finds acceptable. So he's telling us to take on the character of God, the obedience to God, and shape your life around God. In verses 30 and 31, he helps us to see the how of this. We know the consequences. We know the blessings. That's a little bit of an understanding. We understand the character of the righteous and the wicked. We got that. Now, if we're going to live a life focused on God, let's pay attention to 30 and 31 here. And he says, the mouth of the righteous speaks wisdom, and his tongue talks of justice. The law of his God is in his heart, and none of his steps shall slide. Okay, the mouth of the righteous speaks wisdom. The only way that you're going to speak wisdom and talk about justice is if you have those concepts in your heart, your mind, in your body from the law of God as they are defined by God. And once you have that established there, it will come forth in your speech. You want to speak wisdom? Speak God's wisdom. You want to speak justice? You're going to talk about God's justice. And as that travels and it was planted in your heart and in your mind, and as that travels out of your mouth and comes from the very core of your being, because now you've decided not to define yourself by the ways of the wicked, but you define yourself by the ways of God, and you put your trust in God, then your actions will speak of God and will be defined by God. And now we see that we've made some choices. I don't have to fret because of the wicked. It's a very superficial existence that they have. Maybe they have a tremendous amount, but it's just for a little bit of time. God's going to cut it away, like grass, like the green herb. How strong is the grass? How many times have you mowed and the grass was so strong, those little blades just don't chop right through it and cut it down? Grass falls pretty easily. But the permanence that we have with God cannot be broken. What is going to stand up to God? Nothing. And so I ask you now to think about, at the beginning, who did you have on your wall? Maybe it's someone that should be there, that's going to point you towards God. Maybe it's someone like David, that warrior king that put God at the very forefront of his life. Oh, was he troubled by people? Oh, for sure. Did he have people turn against him? For sure. Even people in his own family would turn against him at times. People that he trusted would turn against him at times. Think of the turmoil he had when facing King Saul and having those opportunities. Like, it would be so easy to get rid of, Saul's trying to kill me all the time, and I've got a couple of opportunities to kill him, but I won't. It's the way the world would look at the situation. That's God's chosen. I won't do that. And so David lived a life where he was entirely focused on God, and let me put God first. That was an incredible choice to make. For us, we have the same choice to make. You can value the world and have people that you hold up in great esteem. If you enjoy a certain actor or entertainer or politician, it's totally fine. Do that. But when their life leads you in a direction that's in conflict with God, you have to make the decision to cut it off. You can't live in a way that's going to have you be impressed with what they're doing. If you find yourself in a situation where you're like, well, why do they always seem to be winning? Am I not faithful? I don't seem to be having the success that they are having. You need to reevaluate success. If your view of success is only the accomplishments that take place in this world, you're short-sighted. God asks us to look for a long-term view of success. How many times did he say inherit the land? How many times did he say to wait patiently for him? God is a sure bet. And if God says there will be consequences and that the wicked will be cut down, they will be cut down. They will fall. And if God says that the righteous will be lifted up and the righteous will be blessed, they will be blessed. And if God says that you should shape your life to have His character, then that's exactly what we ought to do. It can be challenging, it can be difficult, but we've got to be determined to do it. What I would ask you to do is to read through Psalm chapter 37, live it, and be willing to teach that and carry it on in the way that David intended it to be done, the way that God intended it to be done as an instructional psalm as well. Thank you very much.